Yes, please.
Okay. Hey, hello. Welcome to our online vote for this week. We're gonna amazing ghost guest with Future Architects France here. Yeah, they're an informal organization of young architectural practitioners and students. They exist beyond the pressures and interest of architectural practice, education, and media. They operate in a number of different capacities, from research to activism and to campaigning. And yeah, thank you for coming and thank you for accepting our invitation for your talk today. And yeah, we have Charlie from the Future Architect of France to talk to you guys. So yeah, you can guess. I guess you can start.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, my name is Charlie, and I'm one of the co-founders of FAF or Future Architects Front, but I think FAF is much more enjoyable to say, so that's what I will be referring to it as today. Let me just open this up for you all. Great. So if you've come across FAF before, it's probably in one of these two formats. The main sort of way that our work manifests is through two social media platforms, Instagram and Twitter. And this is sort of part of the reason why it's kind of traditionally been difficult to actually pin down a sort of concise description of what it is we are and what it is that we do. And typically I've kind of sarcastically avoided answering this by, whenever someone asked what we were, I would usually just say yes, all of the above, whatever you think it is, that's what it is. But you know, now that we are sort of just gone past FAF having existed for 2 years now, you know, it kind of got to the point where we sort of had to actually maybe stop being so flippant and actually figure out, you know, what the hell we are and what we're trying to do. So our kind of journey to discovering that is represented through these two very similar but importantly distinct descriptions, which is we originally were thinking that FAF represented a contemporary form of political engagement within architecture, but kind of quickly realized that what we really want it to be is a contemporary form of political engagement through architecture. And I promise that's not just a semantic difference, and hopefully the importance of the distinction there will become more evident as we progress through. So why do we do that? Why do we think there is value in this kind of political engagement from and through architecture? Well, the main reason is probably because I imagine everyone listening to this right now probably has experienced this kind of feeling either at some point in their life, or maybe if you're more like me, maybe you experience this every day of your life, some kind of sense that everything is on fire, everything is terrible, we should be panicking constantly, but you know, we'll just kind of sit down and have like a cup of tea and say, okay, no, this is fine, we can deal with this. Like I've got a render to worry about, like this is fine. And I think it's really important to kind of, I guess, name this and like not just sort of sweep it under the rug as something that doesn't matter and is inconsequential. So yeah, this is a very real experience for especially younger people today. You know, at the same time, we had a prime minister recently that lasted less long than it took for a lettuce to decay. Like, you know, it's definitely not all in our heads. This kind of sense of crisis really is manifested in very real, very material ways in the world around us, even if it does occur as kind of ludicrous and comical as this. And, you know, it's easy to think of these kind of problems as having emerged like in the last 5 years, maybe. I think a lot of people think of 2016, like the election of Donald Trump, Brexit happening. I think a lot of people tend to see this as a point where things became bad. But what I really want to try and get across today is that all we're witnessing today are the most recent and most extreme manifestations of a decline in political economy that has been happening for decades. And I think one of the most instructive graphs that you'll ever see about this condition and how long things have been getting worse is this image here. So this tracks the rise of productivity and compensation for productivity. So, as technology increases, productivity also increases. So for example, as an architect, we've gone from drawing boards to AutoCAD to Revit and BIM. And with each sort of leap forwards in technology, the productivity of our labor goes up. And historically, as your productivity goes up, so does your compensation. So you produce more, you get paid more. But something happened around the 1980s, which caused these two lines to decouple. So you can see that since the 80s, productivity has continued to increase while compensation has almost stagnated. So we're working more, we're producing more, and yet we're not seeing any of the value of that labor. That value is being sucked up to the owners of assets and the people who profit from the surplus value of that labor. So what happened around this point was the introduction of, in the UK and the US, was the introduction of sort of neoliberal policies. So Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and to help us understand the actual real world effects of those policies, we can look at another data set compared to the two previous data sets, and that is looking at union membership. So for anyone who doesn't know, a union is a collective of workers or a collective of employees who use their collective bargaining power in order to negotiate with their employer. So you as an individual might say, I can't ask for a raise because if I do, they'll just tell me no, or maybe they'll fire me. But if the entire office asks for a raise, well, that's a lot harder to say no to. So that is where the kind of, that's the fundamental basis of the idea of a union, is that by collectivizing as workers, as employees, you have a stronger voice and you are able to secure better material conditions for yourself and your co-workers. So at the time that these two lines were very much following the same trajectory, as productivity rose, so did hourly compensation. You can see a fairly high level of union membership in this time. And then when they decouple, we see the sort of rapid and steep decline of union membership. So this isn't to say that, correlation is causation, because there's a lot of other factors that played a part in this decoupling, like the loss of the welfare state, loss of public spending, loss of public housing, things like this. But we can't ignore the fact that there is undoubtedly a relationship here, even if it's not the absolute full picture. So this is the sort of context that we find ourselves in today, right? So we are sort of living in this late stage capitalist economy where wages have stagnated for decades. We're working more than ever, but we're seeing less than ever of that value that's being generated by our work. In addition to that, we also have problems of economic trajectory in a sort of macro sense as well. So I'm sure everyone is reasonably up to date on the problems of the climate crisis. And one really important thing for us to consider when we're looking at this sort of big picture of political economy is that right now, a state's success, a country's success is measured by gross domestic product, or GDP, right? So you produce more, you are, seen to be a more successful country. The problem with that is that GDP is coupled almost perfectly to carbon output. And there are theories that you might be able to decouple GDP from carbon emissions, but even if this decoupling is theoretically possible, it's not going to happen within the time frame that it needs to occur within. So for practicality's sake, they are essentially coupled, and they're going to stay that way. So if we continue to produce more at a state level, and if we continue to set GDP as a goal, we're going to continue to see rising carbon emissions when we can at least afford them. To join on to that, we also have an issue of material extraction, which is just as important to our sort of ecological crisis, but isn't often talked about as much as carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, for example. And material extraction is even less likely to become decoupled from GDP. So you can see that both in terms of our position as workers and our compensation as workers, but also in the macroeconomic direction of our states, we are sort of facing a very dire situation in both cases. So why is it so rare for architects to engage politically? If we are the dog in the building on fire, why are we saying this is fine? Why are we not trying to do more about it? And this isn't just a sort of hunch that I have. I think this political apathy is backed up by figures like this, where, groups that we do have whose supposed purpose is to lobby the government, is to represent the voice of architecture, the turnout for the elections of these organizations is incredibly low. Council elections are usually below 10%. RIBA president elections are usually below 15% of members who actually vote. So where is this apathy coming from, and how can we try and overcome it? Well, I think one explanation for this apathy is to look at the sort of material origins of people in the architecture profession. And if you look at this research that was conducted in 2021, you can see that under a definition of privileged, which is having one or more parents in a managerial role, architecture came out as the most privileged profession out of a group of other sort of professions that we typically associate as being more privileged, like barristers, judges, journalism, medical practitioners. Architecture came out above all of these. So I think one reason why we might start to see why we've seen this apathy is because while architects may not be minted, they are relatively comfortable. An architect doesn't necessarily have to worry about how they're putting food on the table. And it's important to note that this doesn't necessarily capture the experience of being an architectural worker today. This is more of a historic picture of what it's meant to work in architecture over preceding decades. So this isn't just capturing the experience of the Part 1 architectural assistant. This is also capturing the experience of associates, people who've been working for years and years and years. So this is very likely, from my point of view, one of the reasons why we don't see much political engagement from architects. Another reason is that architecture used to be far more grounded in political processes, in the sense that about 50% of architectural work used to be publicly funded. So in 1976, 49% of all UK architects worked for the public sector. So working on things like social housing, public parks, youth centers, any other kind of public amenity that architects would have been able to design, that was the kind of work they were doing. But as part of that neoliberal process, which we spoke about earlier, as part of Margaret Thatcher's 11-year war against local councils, this kind of spending completely disappeared, which meant that architects went from being essentially 50% publicly funded to today being less than 1% publicly funded. So within 50 years, we've basically seen the profession of architecture become almost entirely privatized. And so we've gone from a profession which was very, very largely and heavily influenced by public interests to one that is almost exclusively steered by private interests and the interests of capital. And this isn't just something that's happened to architecture either. You can see this in the history of political spending when we break up political spending from central government, local government, and public corporations. So you can see that in the 80s, public corporations, which is what would have most directly benefited architects, almost entirely disappeared. You can see more recently, around the time of David Cameron and austerity, that the sort of war on local government was kicked up another level, and central government spending drastically overtook local government spending. So while obviously we are seeing the effects most visibly in the world of architecture, this is something that is affecting the entire economy. So it's important to sort of keep that wider context in mind. So what can be done about this? You know, do we just throw our hands up in the air and say, well, that's bad? I guess we'll just have to deal with it. Well, no, I don't think so. So I think from the position that most of you are likely to be in right now, the position of students, one thing that is of the utmost importance for students of architecture to do today is to fundamentally reject the myths of this profession. And I've kind of selected two really great articles from Failed Architecture, which, if you don't know about Failed Architecture, you definitely should. They're one of the best architecture publications that exist. But I'm going to talk a bit about these two articles that I think do a really good job of dismissing two of the most destructive myths that architects tell themselves. So this first one is by Marissa Courtwright, and the article is called Death to the Calling, a job in architecture is still a job. And essentially in this piece, Marissa Courtwright sort of investigates the way that architects generally do not consider what they do to be work. They consider it to be a calling. They consider it to be something that is a sort of higher purpose that they were almost spiritually destined to undertake. And this doesn't just manifest in the way that we see our work. This also manifests in the way that we communicate, in the way that we refer to the work that we do. So how many architects refer to what they do as a business or a company? Virtually none of them. They all talk about what they do as, oh, this is my studio, or this is my practice, or this is my atelier. They will do almost anything they can to obfuscate from the fact that fundamentally it is a company. But that does not align with the myth of the calling, because the myth of the calling wants you to believe that somehow architecture is elevated above this, when the reality is that it's just not. So getting rid of that idea of the calling is one of the most essential things that I think students should both be doing for themselves, but also trying to do within their, studio and university cultures as well, because the calling isn't just something that, is deployed in workplaces. It's something that's deployed in universities as well. It's the reason why people will work in a way that's very destructive to their health. It's because they're doing it for the greater calling of architecture. And like I said, it's very important that we dismantle this myth. Once, you know, you've got to that point, which maybe many of you already have, maybe many of you are like, yeah, we know this, we know architecture is political, we know it's important, we know that we need to think about climate and social inequality and things like this. Well, once you're at that point, another really important distinction to understand is that while, yes, all design is political, not all politics is design. And again, this is written about incredibly well by Leah Hanrahan in this other failed architecture article, which again, very, very strongly encourage you to go and read. And the distinction that she makes in this piece of writing is that while the work of design practice is, and the work of architecture is inherently political in the sense that who is paying you and who you are working for under what terms is always going to be inherently political. But if you want to change those terms, so for example, if you decide, I want to work on social housing, I want to work on things that are going to benefit the public, well, you cannot design that into existence. No matter how much you want to design public housing, you aren't going to be able to do that through design practice. The only way to move towards a world where you are allowed to design social housing is a political process to get there. That's the only way to do it. You have to realize that the way to make these changes in the political economy is through thinking and organizing politically. So we can't, no matter how many amazing drawings we make, no matter how many beautiful proposals for social housing we can draw, design by itself is not going to make that a political reality. So we need to understand the difference between what can be accomplished by design and what is the sort of political function of design. But then how do we also observe its limitations, and how do we go beyond those limitations to operate as political entities in of ourselves, beyond just working as design practitioners? So to talk a little bit maybe about, I guess, the journey of FAF and how we actually got, I guess, to this point of this position that we have. This might not be new information to any of you who follow the page, but for anyone who hasn't come across FAF before, one of the main ways that it operates is almost as a sort of mirror to the architecture profession. So one of the most common types of stories that you'll see from us is a message from someone working within architecture, maybe studying within architecture, and they will tell us about some kind of usually negative experience that they've had, and then we will share that anonymously, and then inevitably we will get an outpouring of dozens and dozens of other people who have had almost exactly the same experience. So this means that the account has, almost operated as a kind of confessional, where people are able to see that the problems they're facing aren't just their own individual problems, but they're a systemic societal problem and also a cultural problem within this profession. So I think that, this kind of communication is kind of open and anonymous communication, and the way for people to connect on the ways that they're suffering for this kind of work is really, really powerful. And it's what led us to the first sort of, official thing that we ever put out, which was the RIBA open letter. So back when FAF started, we didn't really have much of an understanding of, politics or economics or anything like this, but we could see that there were things wrong. We could see that there were material conditions that were exploitative and were, predominantly harming the most vulnerable people in the profession. So we decided to write an open letter to RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, because we thought that they weren't doing enough. And we conducted a survey which very much validated this, because you can see down at the bottom here, We've asked things like, are you currently employed? Have you ever worked unpaid overtime, which most people have worked unpaid overtime. Most people say that they can't live comfortably on their salaries, but the real motivating factor for writing this letter was the last question, which was, do you feel supported by REBA? Which you can see something like 95% of people said no. So it became very clear that REBA were not performing their role as the voice of architecture. So from this survey data and from hundreds of anonymous experiences that we gathered, we were able to formulate 5 demands that we were making of REBA for this as part of this open letter. And they were to end unpaid overtime. So the REBA has a code of practice that their charter practices have to work according to. So they could, if they wanted to, create a new rule that says that charter practices cannot use unpaid overtime. So that was our first demand. We wanted more oversight for the architectural assistant role. So how can we make sure that this role is actually for education and not just a kind of cheap labor for architectural bosses? Better transparency and communication in the REBA budget and spending, a more representative governing body of the REBA, and accountability for exploitative practices. Because even when the REBA did have a policy that was, in theory, a good policy to have, like they have a policy about practices having to pay the real living wage, they don't do anything about it when practices don't pay the real living wage. So we are also demanding some actual real accountability to be brought into the institution. This was signed by over 1,800 people, which, you know, considering the fact that FAF had only just started at this point, it was maybe a month old. That was, you know, an overwhelming amount of support and an incredibly strong validation of the kind of points that we were trying to raise. And, you know, while it did achieve a lot of support, and while the REBA did meet with us and they did say that they were going to implement, they were going to ban unpaid overtime and they were going to implement all these policies, inevitably, like very often happens with institutions like this, which are big, old, have a lot of inertia, nothing really came of it. So later on we decided, okay, if you aren't gonna listen to the overwhelming voice of architectural workers who are demanding that you do this, then we're going to get rid of you and we're going to bring in someone who is going to do that. So we decided to, alongside groups like UVW SAW, the Architecture Union, alongside Architects Climate Action Network, alongside people who used to be part of the REBA Future Architects team, we launched a sort of collaborative process to get a new REBA president elected, someone who was drama-free, as the AJ sort of hilariously latched onto. And essentially, we created our own hustings and election process where we said that anyone could enter, but the only rules were that they couldn't be an employer, they had to be an architectural worker, and they had to be committed to work towards things like labor rights, social equity, climate action, the things that most architectural workers care the most about. And in case you didn't already know, we won. So the guy that won our internal process, Moyo Oki, he then was put forwards as a candidate in the actual REBA elections. And through his campaigning, through our collective campaigning, through this very, very collaborative effort, he won. And so now, you know, we're at this sort of exciting time where, you know, Moyo may not be able to solve all these problems by himself because he still is one person within a very sort of regressive institute. But what we have done is we've demonstrated that a coalition of workers and a coalition of predominantly young people in architecture can swing these kinds of votes. So we have demonstrated that unlike our sort of predecessors, we can mobilize politically and we can form a significant political bloc. This, I think, was also really well captured through some of the work that we did with the ARB. So back June of 2021, I believe, we met with the AIB to talk about some of the research that we'd been doing into education through the FAF platform. And, that alongside a consultation with other sort of stakeholders and other education groups, along with an open consultation, which we were able to direct a lot of people to respond to, led to the ARB announcing some of the most fundamental shifts in architectural education and training for 50 years. And this one in particular is very topical because you might have seen some of these early changes announced just yesterday. So this is still an ongoing process. And they have released a new consultation for the changes going forward. So I would encourage everyone to get involved in that consultation. And if it's a little hard to understand and if it seems a little opaque, keep an eye on the FAF channel, Instagram channel, because we're going to be unpacking what this means in more depth, and we're going to be kind of, suggesting to people what we think should happen going forwards. So, but yeah, so this is another piece of evidence of the sort of power of mobilizing as architectural workers, as people who care about equity, climate, things like this. We were able to have a significant impact on this consultation and the eventual decisions that the ARB made and are still currently making. And how did we do this? Well, a lot of it was just done with memes and jokes because, while the things we're talking about are incredibly serious, the way that we talk about them doesn't necessarily have to be serious. So everything's kind of depressing enough. So why not have a little bit of fun when we're trying to critique these things or have these conversations? And, I think a lot of people might look at this and say, oh, well, that's very lowbrow. And I would say, yes, exactly. That's the point. The point is that we, when we need to do something serious like an article or a lecture or an open letter, we will bring the necessary nuance and tone to that there has to be. But when we're critiquing these things through a space like Instagram, why not use the most accessible medium? Why not use a medium that is kind of inherently understood by our generation and is able to deliver fairly complex ideas and critiques within a very simple, usually funny image? So we found this to be an incredibly successful sort of campaigning tool and a way of bringing more and more people into the conversation that maybe usually they wouldn't feel like there's a place for them in the conversation, or maybe they wouldn't have the time to properly immerse themselves in it. But by using this kind of, like I said, the language of the internet, it just brings the bar all the way down to the point where anyone with a phone and social media can be involved in, something that is a kind of activism. So just to give some context of some of the other groups that we work with and some of the groups that we really want you guys to know about, if you don't already know about, probably, the main one, particularly from our position as like organizers and people interested in labor rights, better salaries, more democratic workplaces, things like this. The main groups to know about is UVW SAW. So we were talking about unions earlier, and UVW SAW is the architecture union. So this is the group who sort of campaign for no more unpaid overtime. They campaign for better salaries. They campaign for workers to have some say over the kind of projects they're working on. And, shockingly, they were only started in 2019. So they're actually very young as an organization, but they've already had a really significant impact and they're growing quite rapidly. So they're a group who I really believe that if we get more momentum in SAW and if we get more union density in architecture, then suddenly students, graduates, workers won't be quite so powerless as a lot of us feel right now, because we'll have, you know, in addition to organizing campaigns in the way that we do at FAF, we'll actually have real formal power as a worker collective. So definitely encourage you all to follow UVW SAW and join as soon as you go into the workplace. And just so you know, it's not all protesting, and it's not all kind of like hardcore negotiations, and it's not all you know, it's that kind of scary work. A lot of it as well is about education, because we aren't taught to see ourselves as workers. We aren't taught to think of ourselves as being subject to a political economy. So a lot of what UVW SAW do is about yeah, improving our sort of knowledge of the profession and improving our knowledge of how we as workers can make some of these changes that we want to see. But moving on from SAW, there's also ACAN, which again, I hope many of you already know about, but the Architects Climate Action Network are a group who were created out of the frustration of not being able to do effective climate action in their workplaces. So going back to the article, all design is political, not all politics is design, ACAN really embody that, because they realized that in order to take effective climate action, they need to do it outside of the confines of design practice, and they need to do it as a political entity that's not tied to you know, the profit motive that companies are tied to. So yeah, ACAN, definitely a group that I also encourage everyone to join. And just to sort of, I guess, maybe wind this down at the end now, a lot of this can be really daunting. Like a lot of, especially when you're a student, the thought of kind of like putting your head above the parapet and, you know, making yourself a problem is very daunting. And you can also feel like there's no way that you can have the power or the impact for that to be successful, even if you do decide to do that. So one of the things I want to leave you with is this message we got from Reba on 3rd of February. And the reason why this is significant is because we only shared the letter for the first time on the 31st of January. So that means that us, as at the time, a complete no-one organization, like FAF had not existed. FAF was only just been created. No one knew who we were, what we were doing. No one had any reason to care about us. But 4 days after we wrote this letter and it connected with so many people, we got a message from Reba asking to meet with us and talk about the letter. So, you know, I hope that this is a good sort of illustration of just how powerful organizing can be, especially when you take advantage of things like social media and these digital tools that we have access to today. It really can go a lot further than you would expect. And I think a nice kind of way of summarizing all of this is this quote from Catherine Herron, which is, architects have to work from a political base, and if there isn't one, you have to start it. So yeah, I hope that's been interesting or useful, and yeah, we can maybe do some questions or something now.
Yeah, thank you for the talk, and I really appreciate for you coming, and I just really like how there's groups already of like there's mediums or like groups of us being together and like being aware of like what's the exploits and different problems we have in our industry. And I just really appreciate for you to create this group, or like to create this account, just being aware of what's the problems already. And yeah, we can start our Q&A. We can go through the chat actually. There's one thing.
I might need you to read it to me. I don't know if I can see the Q&A.
Okay. Don't think it's, but I can read the message of what a person said. Thank you for this inspiring talk, extremely important and yet so down to earth topic. I was personally delusional that overworking would stop once I graduate, but quickly realized it was just the beginning. The exact first day I started working, battling my inner demons every day since then. So that's what they said.
Oh yeah, I see that now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, if anything, the overwork is worse in practice, because at least, you know, when you're a student, at least the overwork is kind of going towards something that is yours, right? Like it's going towards a project which you will get a grade for, and that's your grade. When you're in a workplace, all the unpaid overtime is it's more value, more surplus value that you're generating for your employer. That's all it is. So you don't even really get the value that you're creating through your work. You know, you're only being given a tiny sliver of that as your remuneration. And the more unpaid overtime you do, the smaller of a percentage of the value you provide you're getting. So it's almost actually worse in practice, because the overtime is just going to, you know, helping the company's sort of bottom line financially. Really, that's the entire function of it. So yeah, it's important to realize that both of these things are bad, but they're bad in different ways. But you know, I think we all have this kind of process at some point. Like the main thing is to not kind of let it beat you down, and if anything, you know, maybe let it fill you with some kind of righteous anger to change things. I think that's the best way to go about it.
You also got a question?
Yeah, supporting and changing the perspective of the interior design world. I mean, not intentionally, but I think pretty much everything we talk about probably applies to interior design as well. And we do have a lot of interior design people talk to us on the platform. We've had interior design people message us and say that, you know, they like got together and asked for a collective raise because of the work that we're doing. So I think, you know, we use architecture as a general term to, I guess, kind of connect with the largest number of people. But as far as I'm concerned, that does also speak to interior design as well. So yes, I think is the answer, but maybe we should say it more explicitly in future.
Okay, my friend has this question. Do you think students' uni experience impacts their experiences in employment? So does education set up for failure in a workplace?
Yeah, so I think if you try and think about it in terms of like what causes what, I think you get into a bit of a chicken and the egg scenario, because education influences practice, which influences education, which influences practice, and it's a little bit like a snake eating its own tail. So I think the way to think about it is that both kind of exacerbate one another. So obviously things like late nights, overtime, kind of putting the work before your own health, a lot of people will experience that for the first time in university, but that university culture is usually created by design tutors who are from practice. So you can kind of like you see the dynamic I'm talking about, where it's just one shitty loop that just keeps kind of reinforcing itself. So I think the important thing is to see it as a condition that sort of transcends this boundary of education and practice. It's a condition that transcends them, because it's a condition that is fundamentally encouraged by the capitalist political economy we live in, first of all, and then specifically the culture of architecture that has emerged within that container of political economy. So I think rather than like pointing fingers at practice and education, I think we instead should be looking at the containers that both of these things sit within, because that in almost every situation is where the actual problem starts, is in the fundamental base around, like, under which these institutions emerge.
There's another question in chat. Do you want me to read it, or?
I think I can see it. So many practices have people in power with ties to teaching, and unfortunately hiring and payment in practice gets sketchy because of it. Do you think academia is its own political landscape FF has to navigate through while lecturing? And I probably was half answering the question in the last one. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, so I think there's like with the architecture, academia is almost like weirdly kind of split into two categories, because you have the design tutors who probably have that run their own small practice, and you know, the teaching is almost a way of subsidizing the running costs of their practice. But then you also have people who are obviously full-time academics, and I think that you know, I was quite interested recently when we did a talk at Westminster, I think, and one of the faculty there, Sean Griffiths, I think is his name, he was talking about how, you know, he and his sort of, and like his co-teachers were organizing a lot of the UCU, like the faculty union campaigns and strikes at their university, and they were trying to come up with ways that the union activity and the labor movement could be a kind of pedagogy and a kind of teaching in of itself. So I think, you know, for full-time academics, I think there's a lot of potential for, I guess, a less problematic political landscape in universities, because the labor movement, UCU, things like that can come into the kind of teaching that you're doing, and I think that's really good. I guess maybe the most problematic areas are probably the slightly conflict of interest situations that arise from people both working in practice while also teaching. I think that's a very tricky situation to navigate in like a purely ethical way.
I have a question. In the future, when our generation become leaders and become like owns this committee of our RBA, do you think we will give a positive impact, or like do we follow back to our predecessors, become shit basically? Do you think our generation will actually be good?
So I think I think it kind of corresponds to a sort of broader question around, like, you know, this idea that, you know, people generally tend to become more sort of conservative as they age, things like that, right? Like the more you own, the more you have to conserve. Like, you know, the reason why so many young people now are so left-wing is because they don't have anything to conserve. So what, you know, why on earth would you be a conservative if you've got nothing to conserve? And obviously that logic makes a kind of superficial, immediate sense. But if you actually look at data around sort of like age groups and political leanings, you'll find that millennials and Gen Z are bucking the trends of previous generations. So we are not becoming more conservative as we age in the way that previous generations have. And I don't think that this is due to any intrinsic quality of our generations. I don't think this is because we're special. I think this is because the way that capitalism works is that as capital accumulates and accumulates and accumulates, there start to become fewer capitalists with greater controls of capital. So, you know, we're seeing a constant rise of billionaires. We're seeing, someone is probably going to have a net worth of over $1 trillion soon. We'll probably have our first trillionaire. So wealth is being concentrated in fewer and fewer and fewer people. And that means that the kind of assets that our parents or our grandparents were able to own as they got older, and the kind of assets that led them to become more conservative, that's not going to happen for us, or it's not going to happen to the same extent. So I think that the disparity and the extreme inequality that we live in, it is an ongoing and recurring crisis of capitalism. And I think that's one of the things that, while obviously in of itself it's really bad, I think that's one of the things that's going to keep us on course for being a more effective generation in terms of fighting for equity and campaigning for things like climate action. And obviously the climate is the other really big thing as well, because the way that we've been organizing, the way that we've been working, the way that institutions have run for the last 3 centuries or more, they literally just can't do that anymore. Like unless we want to be absorbed by the sun, they can't do that anymore. So there's both the economic side of it, where wealth is continually being more concentrated, and that I think is going to keep people in our generation in this kind of progressive mindset. And also climate is the other thing that means that we simply cannot afford to not change. So that's the other thing that's gonna, in my opinion, my optimistic opinion, keep our generation on the right kind of tracks.
Cool. You also got another question from chat.
Yeah, so have you looked at or considered employee-owned trust as a mean of breaking the wheel? The entrenched systems and those born of privilege won't likely be convinced to look towards equitable practices or behaviors. Could this sit as a movement alongside collective action by unions and policies to force change? So I think like employee-owned companies and things like that, I think they're fine. Like if you have a chance to join one, or if you have a chance to get your practice to become one, I think you should, but they're definitely not as strong of a protection as you might imagine. So a lot of the motivation for an employee-owned trust is actually for the partners to have greater liquidity in the company. So a lot of it is not motivated by the kind of sort of benevolence that we might assume it to be. And also, you can still be fired in an employee-owned trust. You can still be, dismissed just as spontaneously as you can do in an LLC or a limited company. The reason why I think unions are more important is because in an employee-owned trust, the balance of power is still very much in the employer's favor, very much in the employer's favor, whereas a union actually fundamentally contests that power in a much more significant way. Not that I think it has to be either or. I think if we can do both, great, let's do both. But from our point of view, and from the point of view, I guess, of like the political position that we hold, we put a lot more hope, I guess, in unions to leverage significant change than in employee-owned trusts. But like I said, like if you can get one, go for it.
Is there any more questions? Irina, you good? You still alive?